Another year has reached its end, and like gamers everywhere, I'm taking a little time to reflect on the games I played this year. Since the start of everyone's favorite global crisis, I've prided myself in branching out and trying all the games I missed out on when I was younger. Which games have aged well? Which ones haven't? And how do the games of the past stack up to the games of today? Since the boys and I are such big fans of tier lists, I've decided to make one of my own to help answer these questions and determine what was the best game I played this past year. So I've come up with this, a 6-tier list where my personal game of the year goes up here, my dishonorable mention goes here, and some other stuff goes in here. I'll be rating them based on how good of a game I think they are, as well as how much fun I had playing them, so be prepared for a hefty dose of bias. And with that, we're off to the races with our first game being PGA 2K21 is a bad game that I enjoyed playing. Sort of. Look, I love a good golf game, but this isn't one, and for one simple reason. You know how most sports games by EA or 2K have some sort of My Career mode where you build a player and then do a season with them? Yeah, that's all this game is. You can do a seasonal championship with your character, or you can do local play with your character, or you can play some rounds online with your character. There's very little to do here. The graphics are fine and the course selection is decent, but aside from a very sexy looking penguin shirt, there's not much to love about this game. It was $60 when it first released, but it's barely even worth its current $20 price tag. If you want a golf game, there are many, many better options. Moving quickly into our D tier, we have the one game I played this year that I didn't enjoy, the original Assassin's Creed. I got about 2 hours in and I was just itching to put it down. There's just too much about this game I don't care for or don't find interesting. Exploring the Holy Land during the 12th century just isn't as fun as you'd think it is. Renaissance Italy was such a perfect setting for Assassin's Creed 2 and its sequels that most other environments just feel bland and empty by comparison. What makes it worse is that everything about this game is just clunky and slow. It takes forever to get from area to area because there's this massive open space you have to travel through just to visit each new city. It doesn't serve any purpose other than to extend the length of the game. Being the first in the series, this game also struggles to balance the storytelling between Altair, the medieval assassin, and Desmond, the modern counterpart. This game is definitely made to make players think it's as much about Desmond as it is about Altair, which is a poor decision since Desmond is way less interesting than any of the assassins. And Altair is just a dick in the early parts of the game. Ubisoft really struggled to make a character that's both likable and interesting. The presentation is sort of drab, the gameplay is a bit janky, and the story just wasn't doing much for me. I don't think this game is necessarily bad, but it certainly hasn't aged well, especially not compared to its successors. Deer Simulator is a title I felt had a lot of promise. I mean, just look at this trailer. Absolutely astounding. In reality, it's just Goat Simulator. This game is wacky and very little else. I can't recommend paying for it, but that doesn't mean it's not worth checking out if you have Xbox Game Pass. It's not good, but it's certainly a unique experience worth having. I feel kind of bad putting Astro's Playroom on the tier list since it's more of a tech demo than a game, but I needed something else to round out D tier. This is an incredibly short platformer aimed to demonstrate the power of the DualSense controller. It can easily be beaten in a single sitting and only becomes moderately challenging when you aim for getting all trophies in it. There's not much to say about this game, however, I will give it props for being a nice museum of PlayStation history, as well as the only game I've played so far that feels like it takes full advantage of what the DualSense has to offer. Assassin's Creed 3 is the 5th game in the Assassin's Creed series. For that reason alone, it gets D tier. This game shares many of the issues that I had with the original Assassin's Creed, mainly it's not nearly as good as 2. Prime example, the world just isn't that interesting to explore. Colonial America still doesn't hold a candle to Renaissance Europe. And once again, we've got this massive open wilderness that connects the various major areas of the game, which just isn't that fun to explore. I also found little attachment to Connor, the assassin for this game. Connor is kind of a dick. I'm starting to notice a trend here. But he's also Native American, meaning his motivation is a desire to save his people. So he's more interesting than Altair. Overall, I found this game to be rather underwhelming, but it had its moments. The best part of the game by far was definitely the sailing, which, despite feeling a bit tacked on and unnecessary, was easily the most fun I had playing this game. I can definitely see why they decided to make another Assassin's Creed game that was centered around this mechanic. Oh, I'll get to you in a minute. Moving right along into C tier, here are the games I found to be average, or at least met my expectations. Starting things off, I don't really know what to say here. I mean, it's a Forza game. You probably know what to expect at this point. It's a fine enough title, but if you're looking for a racing game for the 360, my personal preference is Motorsport 4, since it's a newer game with newer cars and just a bit more to do. Still, Motorsport 3 is alright. It's a Halo game. To be fair, this is a pretty solid remaster of the original title. New multiplayer using Reach's engine, updated graphics in a widescreen format, plus the ability to switch between original and updated graphics on the fly. That is a cool feature. Unfortunately, the 360 was flooded with Halo titles, so it's rather difficult for this one to stick out among the rest. Still a solid game though, and if you're hurting for some Halo, then it'll do. NASCAR Heat 5 is a unique enough racing game, and if you're a hardcore NASCAR fan, then I'd probably say it's worth it. It isn't quite my thing, unfortunately, nor do I believe it's most people's, but it's a good looking game with a decent track selection and competitive gameplay. Genshin Impact is about as frustrating as it is enjoyable. I wanted to play this game because I heard it was inspired by Breath of the Wild, a game that I love. Don't get me wrong, there are many elements here that were clearly inspired by Breath of the Wild, but this is still a unique experience, and I don't like it that much. Number one, this game is slow. Each main story mission can require literal hours of grinding in order to gain enough experience and items to unlock it. I've played this game for a solid 50 hours, and I'm only on chapter 2 of 7 in the main story. Number 2, this game heavily uses gacha, incentivizing players to spend real-world money in order to get better in-game characters and items that would be very difficult to obtain for free. This is the only thing that makes Genshin Impact feel like a mobile game when it's otherwise a pretty impressive title. However, my biggest complaint is that this game isn't finished. The only reason I've played until just Chapter 2 in the main story is because that's all that's been released so far, hence the reason for its slow story progression. The world of this game is massive and rather beautiful, but you don't have access to most of it right now. The game plans to continually add new areas and main story missions until it reaches its conclusion, but at the rate it's going, the game won't be finished until the second half of this decade. It's a pretty solid free-to-play title, but it requires a very dedicated fan base, and just isn't my thing. Spider-Man Miles Morales is a small game, and I think that's my main problem with it. Despite being a launch title for the PS5 alongside Demon's Souls, Call of Duty, and not much else, I can't say I'm too impressed. This game is painfully short. You can easily beat it in under 10 hours, and that's just way too short for an open world game. I played through this game twice and collected all trophies for it for no reason other than it was easy and I wanted to feel like I was getting my money's worth. And that still took me less time than one playthrough of Spider-Man PS4. In fact, this game is practically just a reskin of that game, but with much less to do. If this had been a $20 or $30 DLC for the first game, I think that would have been more than reasonable, but this game was $70 new, and many stores are still asking up to $50 for it. This game feels like it was rushed out for the sole purpose of being a PS5 launch title. I'll put it in C tier for its fun gameplay, but there's just not enough content here. Ratcheting Clank for PS4 also suffers from Miles Morales disease in that it's much shorter than I thought it would be. Doesn't mean I dislike it though, I think I definitely get more out of it than Miles Morales. This game is very fun to play, the gunplay is good, and there's some tricky puzzles and a surprising amount of death for a kid-friendly game. There's also a fair bit of witty dialogue and references to previous games, which I always appreciate. The platforming is fine, and there's plenty of collectibles for those wishing for a more challenging experience. This game is fun enough to warrant multiple playthroughs, but it's still very short and can easily be beaten in a few sessions. I know some longtime fans of the franchise weren't too impressed, but this is my first Ratchet & Clank game, so I can't really speak to how this game compares to the older titles. Overall, I'd say it's a fun time and worth picking up, but not much more than that. I waited 7 years to play this game. Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl is the long-awaited remake of the fourth generation of Pokemon games. I'm sure every Pokemon fan had high hopes for this game, and based on the review scores, I think it's safe to say I enjoyed it more than most others. Interestingly, this game was made by Ilka. They were handed the reins while Game Freak went to work on something else, I guess. And overall, I think they did a decent job for their first time. Yes, this game has its fair share of issues, including numerous bugs and glitches, but at the end of the day, this game was never going to live up to the fanbase's expectations. Personally, I appreciate Ilka for staying rather faithful to the original titles, for better or for worse. The chibi art style has been incredibly divisive, but I don't hate it as much as I thought I would, and it feels like a natural evolution from the art style of the first games. And the game's difficulty is pretty low right up until the Elite Four because Cynthia is still a bitch to play against. You know what? I think I actually hate this game. Let's go ahead and move into B tier. I was going to review this as three separate titles since this is my first time playing the Uncharted games, but since they're all part of the same collection, I'll just do them all at once. Uncharted is essentially the video game equivalent of Indiana Jones. The main thing that will be drawing you in each time is the story, which usually goes like this. Protagonist Nathan Drake discovers some legendary place or object is real. He tries to find said place before the villain. Location is cursed. Drake has to escape as the legendary location is destroyed. The villain dies, and Drake gets the girl at the end. Oh yeah, spoilers. I don't mean to sell these games short or anything. The gameplay is honestly pretty fun, and the storytelling is really solid. It's just that saying it aloud made me realize how repetitive these games can be. Of the three, I think the general consensus is that Uncharted 2 is the best, and I think I have to agree, though I enjoyed my time with each of these titles. I also think that buying this collection is more than reasonable since each of these games is incredibly short. I think they're definitely replayable, meaning this collection is absolutely worth it if you're new to the Uncharted franchise. These are good story games, and deserve to be experienced at least once. However, of the Uncharted games, the fourth is by far the most game you'll get, as it's almost twice as long as any of the first three entries. I don't think it's all necessary additions, the story and gameplay do drag a bit at times, but for the most part, this is a great conclusion to Nathan Drake's story. I also think it's by far the most realistic, or at least believable, of the Uncharted games, as they've changed the story to focus less on myths and legends. They also tweaked the gunplay quite a bit, which in my opinion helps sell the realism of the game. Overall, I think these are great games, and if you haven't played them yet, they're definitely worth trying out. You can usually pick up both for around 20 bucks at your local GameStop, and I think that's a deal worth considering. Yes, I finally played what many consider to be one of the definitive open world racing games. And I liked it. I can't say I fell in love with it like many others have, but this is a game I could sink some time into. I'm familiar with Criterion games via their Need for Speed Most Wanted reboot, and Burnout Paradise is a very similar title minus licensed cars. Considering wrecking yourself and others is rarely a hindrance and occasionally rewarded, it's certainly a unique game and a really good time. I'm not a huge fan of arcade racers, which I think is the main reason I didn't get too into Burnout Paradise, but I enjoyed what I played, and it's definitely a game I can come back to. This one's been on my wish list for a while. In short, Art of Rally is a beautiful love letter to everything rally racing was, is, and could have been. It's a fairly standard rally racer, only it's played from a bird's eye perspective, which is pretty unique. This game has a very beautiful art style where simple, vibrant, and well lit polygons make up this game's environment, but don't let that fool you. This game's controls are very tricky to get used to. It has a surprisingly sim racer feel to it, so much so that I believe a wheel setup isn't entirely unwarranted here. There are dozens of cars and liveries inspired by real world counterparts. You can just tell whoever made this game is a huge racing fan. This is a beautifully stylized and very charming title with enough content to make it worth the time of rally enthusiasts everywhere. Now listen, I'm an American. Like any true patriot, I grew up on the Xbox. This means that growing up, my racing game of choice was Forza Motorsport, so I was always a bit alienated from PlayStation and their rival franchise, Gran Turismo. Thus, I was formally introduced to the Gran Turismo franchise earlier this year after picking up Gran Turismo Sport, and This is probably one of the best racing games I've ever played. Now, this game isn't for everyone. GT Sport places a massive emphasis on realism, and a majority of the content revolves around online racing, meaning this game is highly competitive, even for Gran Turismo, and much more than any Forza title that I've played to date. Playing this game with a controller is like trying to eat cereal with a fork. It's possible, but are you really getting the most out of your experience? Jokes aside, it's more than possible to put in some good lap times on a controller, but if you really want to get into this game's competitive scene, then a wheel setup is more or less necessary. Still, this is a fantastic looking and fantastic feeling racing game that'd be great for people who want to get into sim racing. Now, this is what I call a sequel. Rift Apart takes everything that the last Ratcheting Clank game did and improves upon it massively. The story is much grander and more complex than the last game. The worlds are much larger and have more to do and find. There's a few new gameplay mechanics, all of which really help give this game its own identity. Also, this game is absolutely gorgeous. The lighting and graphics are out of this world. And of course, there's the same ridiculous and witty dialogue that I've come to expect and love from these games. However, as much as I really like this game, the big issue I have with it is the price. I know $70 is the new standard for ninth gen games, and maybe I'm having a hard time accepting that, but it still seems like a really steep price for a new video game. And as much of an improvement I feel like this is over the previous title, it's still a fairly short game, and I feel like multiple playthroughs or earning all trophies is a requirement of getting your money's worth, which is more than doable, but it still stings since there isn't too much about this game that feels like it just couldn't have been done on PS4. Rift Apart is a great game and a really fun time, but it doesn't quite cut it as a Game of the Year contender for me. Speaking of which, finally we've reached A tier. Here are all the games that went well beyond my expectations and that I consider to be some of the most fun experiences I had this year, starting with finally, a good Assassin's Creed game that I played this year. I consider Assassin's Creed 4 to be a must-play because it's one of the definitive titles of its genre. No, I'm not talking about open world or action-adventure games. What I mean is that AC4 is one of, if not the, definitive pirate game. First of all, AC4 features one of the biggest maps the franchise has seen to date. There are numerous Caribbean cities, ports, and islands for you to explore, all of which are connected by a massive sea upon which you can pillage and plunder to your heart's content. Just traversing this world is fun. Your crew cheers whenever you take the helm and they sing sea shanties. It's too perfect. This game follows the story of one Edward Kenway. Edward is a dick, but he's also a pirate, so it checks out. Edward is a completely unique character, and there's a lot of focus on his internal strife and his constant questioning of his actions and lifestyle, meaning this game does a really good job of making Edward feel like, a person. Although I don't feel like I'll play an Assassin's Creed game that can quite live up to 2, Black Flag is definitely my second favorite in the franchise. If you want a game about pirates, I would absolutely recommend that you pick up a copy if you can. I doubt you'll regret it. Aside from Pokemon, I've never been the biggest fan of RPGs. It's not a genre I intentionally avoided, it just sort of happened that way. So I decided to end that streak this year by picking up a few RPGs for my new PlayStation collection, one of which ended up being one of the top games of 2020, the Final Fantasy VII Remake. First of all, this is without a doubt the most visually attractive game I played this year. It is jaw-droppingly gorgeous. And second, this is a pretty fun time. The gameplay isn't too hard to get used to, the combat has a bit of a learning curve, but inventory management isn't too bad. It's a bit repetitive at times, but overall not too bad. I think it's good for people who are newer to RPGs as a genre. In short, this is a great looking and great playing game with a fascinating world and endearing characters. This is a great title for those looking for one of their first RPG experiences, and is well worth the price of admission. God, this game is stressful. I'm not ashamed to admit that Metroid Dread is my first Metroid experience. Hell, with a 19-year-long hiatus since the last 2D Metroid, I'm sure I'm not the only one. I haven't finished it yet, but I think it's a pretty solid game so far, and I've enjoyed what I've played. The world, like any Metroid game, is super large and very easy to get lost in, especially since you are bombarded with enemies, upgrades, and path choices from the get-go. Speaking of combat and enemies, there's what makes this game special. The Emi are large, creepy research robots that roam certain parts of the map in this game. They will chase you, cannot normally be damaged, and being caught by one will result in an instant game over. In other words, Emi zones are often tense, stressful, or even downright terrifying. There are plenty of unique bosses in this game, but the Emi are the one enemy you will remember this game for. Like almost every game in A tier, Dread is presented wonderfully. This game is a treat to look at, even on Switch, and the sound design works to stress you out even more than you were before. Since I haven't fully finished my playthrough, I can't speak too much on it, but it's definitely worthy of being considered a Game of the Year contender. This game makes me feel like an absolute badass, and for that reason alone, it deserves A tier. Insomniac Spider-Man is one of the most fun open-world games I've yet played, and is definitely one of the must-play games for PS4. New York City is ridiculously fun to explore, and is packed full of side missions, collectibles, and references to the Marvel Universe. You really need to explore every corner and back alley of the city in order to fully appreciate the amount of effort put into this game, which is no problem since web swinging from building to building is easy to learn and ridiculously fun, so much so that I rarely use the fast travel mechanic. The combat is also really fun. It's a real treat figuring out all the ways you can take down enemies, and the story is really good for an open world game. I think this game has a more mature and better written story than most Spider-Man movies. There's dozens of interesting, complex, and well-realized characters. It's a great story, and I loved playing through it. This game is such a blast. I loved playing it, will probably play through it again, and I definitely consider it my favorite PS4 game so far. Ooh, big surprise. Favorite game franchise ranks high in tier list. Yes, despite its numerous bugs and glitches and other issues, Forza Horizon 5 is still my favorite game that came out this year. And that's because it's probably the most fun game I played this year. Horizon 5 nails pretty much every requirement to be a great open world racer. It has a massive map with diverse environments, hundreds of unique cars to drive and customize, seasonal events and rewards to keep you coming back week after week, and terrible teammates who ram you in online races. This game, like all Horizon titles, is visually stunning, but what's truly impressive is Horizon 5's audio design. All cars sound fantastic and completely unique from one another, and certain modifications will change how your car sounds, just like in real life. This game is one of the few titles I can comfortably say is worth its price tag, and if you have Game Pass, it is a must-play. This is definitely my favorite game that came out in 2021. However, it's not quite the best game I played this year. That honor is reserved for a very special title, one of the top games of 2020, and the very first game I played this year, none other than... Yes, I know I'm about a year late, but I don't care because I finally get to talk about Hades. Holy shit, this game is incredible in every way. The gameplay is so fun and ridiculously addicting. There's this constant need to go back for just one more run that keeps you coming back over and over again. The art style is absolutely awesome. The characters are so well designed. The environment is the most picturesque hellscape I've ever seen, and the music. Oh my god, this game's soundtrack kicks so much ass that I saved the album to my Spotify. It's outrageously good, especially the final boss theme. All the characters are so good. Not only are they well written, but they're complex and so full of life. You could tell that there was an unbelievable amount of effort put into this game. Literally thousands of lines of dialogue were recorded for this game, which would be impressive even for most AAA titles, but this is a $25 indie game. This game is less than half the price of almost any other title in this tier list, and yet it's had just as much, if not more, love, care, and effort put into crafting its characters, its story, its world, its music,
everything. I love this game so much, I actually bought it twice and might buy it again. Please play this game. Please.
Well, that was a fun little trip down memory lane. This year made me realize just how expensive video games are becoming and how few new games I play each year because of that. It's sort of a shame, but I don't mind waiting a bit for games to become cheaper, and it gives me an excuse to hunt down some older titles and play those as well. I guess I'm a bit of a cheapskate, but I just hate the idea of wasting my money. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go buy my fifth copy of Hades.